your average convo, not your average life. Not your everyday mother, not your typical wife. Not your usual podcast, listen to and see. So hope that you will stop a while and spend some time with me.
I am so glad to see you. Welcome to Workship.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. This is so much fun, Sarah.
This is just a gift. It's a gift. These conversations, I just feel like I'm having my own little personal party, but I know that there's so much richness that we're going to be able to share with everybody. So thank you.
Yeah.
It's wonderful to be with you.
Here.
Well, tell everybody, give everybody, as my grandmother would say, who are you and who are your people? Give us a little sort of a bit of an overview of just, how you give the elevator pitch of Margaret.
Yeah, I'm a history professor at the University of Washington. I teach about the political and economic history of the United States, mostly the modern United States, and because I'm a history professor, I define modern as starting around 1877. But I actually have written a lot about the history of the technology industry and Silicon Valley. My most recent book was a history of the Valley, but I've been studying the phenomenon of the tech industry and its people and the politics that helped create it and continue to drive it for about, 20 years now, since the dot-com era. It's kind of crazy.
It is crazy, but you're not a California native, right?
No,
I am as you and I know.
I am a proud native of Little Rock, Arkansas, Sarah Staley.
Yes, and that's how we know one another. Yeah, so just so that everybody knows, Margaret and I actually used to ride in carpool together and have play dates. So it's
go way back.
Yeah, we do go way back. But so that must have been, share with people. I mean, while you're in Washington now and you've focused a great amount of your work on Silicon Valley as well as modern history. Let's kind of start a little bit from the beginning, because I think so many people are on their journey very early and into high school and college. So tell us about growing up and childhood and students and what motivated you in your household.
Gosh, I when I was growing up, it's not like I was sitting there going, I want to be a history professor. You knew me then. But I loved reading, and I did love history. I did love the past. And I think also where we grew up had as one of the reasons I do what I do. I went to Little Rock Central High School for high school, the famous site of the crisis at Central High in 1957. I remember, the 30-year anniversary of that crisis was when I was there. It was the beginning of my senior year. And I remember the Little Rock Nine coming back. I think that was the first time all 9 of them had come back as a group to the high school. And by that point, Central was majority minority. It was very socioeconomically diverse on pretty much every metric. And I think like realizing that something, that history was tangible and close to something that I knew, and that history is made by people. It's not just these, hypothetical things. There's no inevitability in history. It's people making change. And then that was reinforced after I went away to college to Northwestern in Chicago. I wanted to get out of the South and go to a big city, and going to Evanston, Illinois was the perfect destination for me. And then I majored in history and English there, and just but again, wasn't thinking I was going to be a history professor. I didn't quite know what I wanted to do. And my post-college story is a story that I tell my college students, this sort of juniors and seniors who were starting to freak out about what's my next step. It makes them very happy when I tell them this story, because I talk about how I graduated in June 1992 without a job. I had completely failed in every attempt at on-campus recruiting. I had a lot of interviews and not gotten any jobs. And I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I really didn't. And it was really unmooring and unnerving. And I ended up, as many a college senior does, going back to my childhood bedroom in the summer of 92 to try to figure it out. And of course, Little Rock was the last place I wanted to be. I wanted to be in, Chicago. I wanted to, be in the swim of things. But it was June 1992, and you know what was happening then. Governor Bill Clinton was running for president. And so I think my mother, after about 4 days of me moping, was like, you have to go do something. So I just walked down the street. I went down the street a mile down the road to the headquarters, and I showed up and I volunteered, and I made copies for day one, came back the next day, made copies. It was really, so as soon as I walked in the headquarters, like, oh, there's something going on. This is really exciting.
Mm.
And so I spent 2 days volunteering, standing at a copy machine, making copies and watching the world swirl around me. All these young people from DC and New York and Chicago and everywhere else, all this energy. And day 3, someone grabbed me and kind of took me down the hall for some other task. And he said, we're sitting there going through stuff. And he's like, hey, do you want a job? I'm like, really? And he's like, yeah, there are jobs in the correspondence office. You know, we're going to pay you. You know, you get paid $1,100 a month. And I was like, ooh, I'll get a job. I'll like live at home. This could be a something. I was already hooked. And the rest is history. And and so, you know, 5 months later, I find myself in the West Wing of the White House at age 21 going, what on earth happened? And realizing again, this reinforcement that history is made by people and made by people that I knew of. And I was this small player in this extraordinary thing. And it's, you know, that set me on this very different path than I ever expected.
Isn't that glorious? Just how, you know, it really is just stepping into the doors that open and the opportunities that present themselves, even sometimes if it's bemoaning or begrudgingly, or you're just like, oh, I don't, you know, I'm not sure I want to take this opportunity. So, okay. So you've gone and volunteered with the Clinton administration, and then you find yourself in the West Wing. And so what did you do? What did you do for the Clinton administration?
Well, like all good people in their early 20s, I was someone's assistant. And so I learned one really very important lesson for every workplace, which is you want to have a good boss. You want to have someone who recognizes you, who gives you opportunities to not just be in the room and see what's going on, but also gives you opportunities to do things on your own and forces, you know, pushes you out of beyond your comfort level. And I was so lucky. I started off as a staff assistant working for Gene Sperling, who was one of the economic advisors in the West Wing. He worked in the Clinton administration, ended up being the national economic advisor, and then went back and did the same thing for Barack Obama. And so I was part of this team of, we still call ourselves Team Econ. There's still people who are dear friends to me to this day. We were all really young. We all, you know, Washington, D.C. just thrives on very young people who are willing to work all the time for almost no money.
Yes.
And so that was what we did for years and years. And I made some dear, dear friends. And I also learned what it is to be a good boss. I learned from the people. I was in the White House for a few months. And then I realized that if I was, as a young person, if I wanted to do substantive things, if I really wanted to learn about policy, if I wanted to do my own writing and kind of have some more autonomy, you needed to sacrifice the glamour of the West Wing and go work in an agency. And so I went to Health and Human Services, which is one of the cabinet departments. I worked in the office of Secretary Donna Shalala, who was another great model, a role model, someone who really promoted young women and was and modeled what leadership looked like. She's now in her 70s and is a freshman member of Congress from South Florida. She ran in 2018 and now she's in the House. I mean, she's just extraordinary, an extraordinary person. So again, like the learning from the men and women who I worked for, the people who were very high up and seeing how they did their job. And then also being so fortunate to work for people who were willing to give someone in their early 20s an opportunity to see what they could do.
Yeah. Margaret, when you were at that time, both in the White House and in HHS, were you aware of the fact that you had great bosses? I mean, were you observing the differences between leadership and the good, the bad, and the ugly at that time?
I was. And I also was able to observe the difference between people who were extraordinary contributors to an organization on their own and maybe weren't as fantastic as bosses. And I think that everyone brings that. Like, not everyone, it seems strange, but not everyone can be a great boss. Some people are, and look, now I work in academia, and we professors are notorious for not being we're not very good at kind of, we're lone actors. But we have other strengths. And so, but I think that not, a good boss is someone, particularly a good boss of a younger person, is someone who is really, looking at talent, not looking at resume, and is also willing to take a bit of a risk. It is a risk not to manage everything yourself. It is a risk to delegate to other people, particularly if they're young and untested. I think the political world creates an advantage for young people, in part because we're willing to work so hard for so little money. But also it's so fast moving and so reactive that for all of the talk about government bureaucracy being so slow to change, when you're actually, particularly if you're like I was, a political appointee in a presidential administration, or you're a staff member on Capitol Hill, or you're working in a state capitol, in a state legislature, you're moving really fast, and you are, every day is a new adventure and often a new crisis.
Yes, it is. I know that well myself, but so exciting and so fun. Hey, is there like a moment that you can remember or two that guided your career compass in a way that you said, okay, I do know that I want to go to graduate school, or perhaps I know what it is that I want to do? Was there something that was a signature telling?
Yeah, I did have a moment. Well, Washington, D.C. is a funny place. Well, I think the business world too. You graduate in your early 20s, and then you have a few years, and then everyone starts going to graduate school, right? So if you're in the business world, people are going and getting their MBA. In DC, everyone goes to law school or maybe public policy school. And so you kind of get this plateau, and you realize, okay, if I want to go to the next level, I'm going to go and I need to go and do this. And I thought about going to law school because that's what everyone did. And I realized I didn't want to be a lawyer. I was trying to figure out how to go to law school and not be a lawyer. And what I didn't realize at the time is what I wanted to be was a history professor. But I hadn't quite internalized that. But my moment of clarity, which was, it was the day after the 1994 midterm elections, which people may recall were not very good outcomes for the Democratic Party or for Bill Clinton. It was this referendum on the Clinton administration, and this was an election in which Republicans won majorities in both the House and the Senate. Newt Gingrich then became Speaker of the House, and Democrats had been in charge. And this was and people got lost who weren't supposed to lose. And so for at the time, I was a Democratic operative, Democratic political appointee. Everyone around me was sort of the same, in the same boat. And we all went, the chief of staff of the HHS took all of us to lunch the day after the election at this kind of dire restaurant that's down by HHS. It's probably still there. I can't remember what it was called. It had horrible like velvet Elvis paintings on the wall. Anyway, and we sit there at this long table, and Kevin, and Kevin's our chief of staff is sort of a pretty circumspect guy. He's a boss, but he just gets a bunch of pitchers of beer, and it's the middle. It's like it's a Wednesday. Yeah, and we're sitting at this long table, and we're all literally drowning our sorrows. And I think that moment, and then the aftermath of that, I was so, I was 24, I was young, I was idealistic. I was like, we worked so hard, and we wrote all this,
doing the right thing,
and it's not going to go anywhere. And now I'm a little more realistic than like, come on, get over your idealism. But at the time, I was like, I don't think I want to do this. I don't think I can do this for my career. I don't want to. I need to do something different. And then I also was like, what Washington, D.C. needs is it needs more history. It needs to, I'm going to go get my PhD in history. And then I'm going to come back, and I'm going to speak truth to power and show them how, the past informs the present. It didn't really, my path to doing that. At the time, I thought the only means to that end was you get your PhD, then you come back and work at a think tank like Brookings or something like that.
Yeah.
I didn't think that being a professor was the way to do that. Now, where are we? We're 26 years later. That actually has been where I've ended up, which is an extraordinary journey.
It is extraordinary. So, God, I love this. So you go to, then you go to graduate school. Were you in Pennsylvania? Do I know that?
I was at the
Yeah.
University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, which is awesome. Go Quakers.
And there you cement your direction that you do want to become a professor.
Well, it's funny. I showed up my first semester. I walk in September 1997. I was, and I walked into my first seminar, and I quickly realized, oh, I have this idea that I'm going to go be a think tanker, applied public policy person. I'm being trained to be a professor. Like that's, wow. And you think I could have just, I should have figured that out before I showed up. Anyway, so I had this, moment of, oh God, like what's going on? But again, leaders and mentors were everything. So the best thing about the University of Pennsylvania, well, there were many good things, but I went to Penn to work with a historian named Michael B. Katz, who was a historian, social historian of American education, of American politics and social policy. I'd worked a lot on welfare reform when I was in the Clinton administration. And so I went into graduate school thinking I was going to write the history of those types of programs, anti-poverty programs to help, particularly to help women and children. And Michael and the other members of my committee, my other advisors there, were both kind of open to having a student who was an unconventional student. I had come in with this background of 5 years working in Washington, D.C. I hadn't written a senior thesis in undergrad. I hadn't done the things that people usually do before they go to the PhD program. And encouraged me to, in the summertime, go work at the Brookings Institution and to take classes across Penn with city planners and sociologists and in the business school to really round out my understanding of the past. And so that was, again, like the people I've worked with and worked under shape who I am now. I may not be a boss to an organization now, but I am now a mentor to graduate students. And what Michael's modeling, the way that he coached me, the way that he supported me is absolutely, even the way he runs a graduate seminar, I model what I do on what he did.
How fortunate you were.
Yeah.
How fortunate you were with graduate school dons and leaders and in your administration and roles that you had such good modeling behaviors to be able to follow. I wish I could say the same. I wish many people could say the same. Yeah. I often will say that, I think sometimes that I hold myself to this very high level of management now because of perhaps many situations where I worked for people who were toxic or not. Yeah. So I think you can learn as much from those as well, but I'd much rather have had perhaps an experience like yours.
Yes. Yeah. It's luck. So much of our journeys have to do with luck. Don't you think? Like, what if I'd gotten that job at Leah Burnett Advertising in Chicago in the spring of 1992 and had gone to work in advertising? Where would I be now? What would I be? What would my family be? Like, so many life choices. It's kind of terrifying when you think about it, but it's also incredibly empowering. And it also realized there's some things you can control. You can take advantage of the situation you're in and make the most of it. And there are also some things kind of beyond what you can control, and you have to recognize that and not feel like you have to, that you failed in some way if it didn't work out in a certain trajectory.
Yeah, totally. All right. So at some point you picked up a pen, or a phone, or a laptop, and you started to write and dig and uncover. When was that?
It started in graduate school. And it's funny because I went into graduate school planning to study poor people. And I exited graduate school writing a dissertation about rich people. But it's all the same political economy, right? It's all connected.
Wow.
So, I think if I could sum up what when I describe what my research is all about, it's about how politics and business interact with one another. And again, it's very much shaped by my experience in the Clinton administration in the 90s, where I worked on programs such as the Empowerment Zone program, which was an effort to re-inject capital investment into neighborhoods in large cities and rural areas that had been sort of redlined out of that investment because of structural racism, because of the nature of the built environment, all sorts of things, kind of remedy things that public policies and markets have gotten wrong. And I think the tech industry is a great place to study that interaction, in part because the tech industry for a long time was like, nope, government had nothing to do with our success. And there isn't, and even when I was embarking on, this book I just published is my third book. Even when I was embarking on the research for that about 6 or 7 years ago, when I did my first interview, some of the, one person who I spoke to in the early stages, I was telling him, well, part of what I'm going to do in this book is talk about the connections between Washington, D.C. and Silicon Valley that have been there over time. And he's like, oh, wait, okay. Can we just put a pin in that for a second? I'm like, mm-hmm. And he's like, can I just tell you something author to author? Because he's written like lots of books about social media. And he's a real he's a real powerhouse. He's been around the Valley for a really long time. And he's like, if you write a book like that, it's going to end up on the remainder table because there's no story there. There's nothing there. That was in 2014. I think even he would agree that there's really a story there, that in the ensuing years, there's been a lot of tech is now is a political story. And that's been a really interesting, to have something that I've been pursuing for so long to suddenly become the thing that everyone's like, oh yeah, there is something there.
Yeah. So let's get clear.
My job easier.
Yeah. So for our listeners and people who are watching, so the book that we're discussing is The Code, right? So
The Code. Yeah.
So The Code, Silicon Valley and the Remaking of America. And it's been listed, or people refer to it as the definitive history of Silicon Valley for our time. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I was reading about is that per this gentleman's comment, that perhaps there was a very shallow understanding of the relationship between Silicon Valley's success and government. And then you focused on that perhaps even from the 40s to the present. Tell us, fast forward past this person's commentary, which is, there's no story there, to then getting into what you uncovered and how you did it.
Yeah. Well, you know what? The belief that there is no story there is actually part of the secret of Silicon Valley. So what I trace in the book, it's real. I mean, it's a business history. It's a history of the companies and the people and the people you've never heard of. But it's one that's intertwined with American political history and social history and cultural history. I wrote this book in part because, you open a U.S. history textbook, like, high school students would read, and you're reading about 20th century US, right? And you read about wars and presidents, and you might read about social movements and activism. And then maybe there'll be like a sidebar feature that's like, ooh, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, computers, totally. Right?
Yep.
And even then, and Silicon Valley, where you are, is, I think, again, part of its secret is it sort of sees itself as a place apart, a place that thinks different, a place that is different from other types of businesses, types of industry. It's special, it's smart. And yes, it is. It's different, but it is a product of the Cold War military spending. It's a product of the political changes of the last couple, in both sides of the aisle. I write a lot about the Clinton administration and this. It was kind of trippy. Like, I'm writing about things that happened down the hall from where I was. Wow. I wasn't working on tech policy, but I was for 2 years working after HHS went to Al Gore's office, and I was working on empowerment zones. But I remember these Silicon Valley people like Mark Andreessen and John Doerr showing up for meetings, and I didn't know who they were. Yeah, I was just like, whatever, crazy Valley people. So what I wanted to do was, when you tell the full story, and no one had really told the story of the Valley's history of these tech companies from the 40s to the present, kind of connected it all together for a broad audience. You can't leave the politics out. You can't leave the culture out. We're all products. Business is a product of the broader culture and society it's in, right? It's not this special thing. It can't. And what's remarkable about what happened was the US government, it's not just look, the government is, made everything, thank the government. No, 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 no. That's wrong. It's just as wrong as saying entrepreneurs did it all. The way it actually happened was this commingling of the two. There was all this money flowing into the valley for things like microelectronics, semiconductors, the things that all these defense contracts for small electronics that create this incredible market, super competitive market, that these companies that are super entrepreneurial, that are super competitive, that then are, pushing the boundaries of what's possible. It's this symbiotic relationship between public and private. It's a totally American story, made in America story. It has to do with, and it's a great one. It's one where the heroes are both the government types and the entrepreneurial types. It's not one or the other. And sometimes you have a really hard time holding that idea in our head. It's like, it's either it's the public sector or it's the private sector. It's, and they don't get along. No, actually, it's the two of them together, and that helps us explain why. And I think it's a really important lesson for like right now, like what's the next generation? What's the next moonshot? How do you get to the next wave of true innovation? You're going to have some public sector investment in things that the market, even the deepest pocketed big tech companies, do not have the resources to finance, say, a complete pivot to green energy, which would be, could have huge market upsides. But you can't do that on the front end. You need some government intervention.
Yeah. So we're recording this during the time of the COVID pandemic, and we're all shelter in place, and our economy is in a challenging state. And I know that you've been writing some articles just recently in the New York Times and in other locations. And one of the things that you've been talking about is, while this book is defined as the definitive history of Silicon Valley, it's so interesting to think of where we are now and how, in this unforeseen experience, how this will likely be rewritten. What do you think is held for the next, whether it's a literal or a figurative chapter of our American history?
Yeah. Well, the future is unknown, but I think history is really valuable in that, look, history doesn't repeat itself. It's not like we're not, destined to do this, but we can see patterns. And so I've been looking really hard. I'm a big one for pattern recognition, right? Like that's a sort of catchphrase and in tech. And I use that too. So I'm looking, I'm spending a lot of time looking back at the 1930s and 1940s, a time in the United States and the world of extraordinary, unprecedented economic crisis and disruption. And what happened then, it enlarged the realm of the politically possible in the United States. So ideas about things like Social Security or, federal support of mortgages to keep people from having foreclosure. Those have been kicking around for decades in policy circles, policymaking circles. It took a Great Depression for those to become reality. Same thing with World War II. You have a business community that mobilized, the business community that, by the way, included a lot of people who were not big fans of Franklin Roosevelt or the New Deal or government action, full stop. People like Alfred P. Sloan, who was the president of General Motors, like said all sorts of nasty things about FDR and like had, saw what he was trying to do as an assault on free enterprise. But what happens in the 40s? Detroit automakers, including and other manufacturers, they basically like, yep, we're in. Like, what do we need to do to win this war? And they, look, it was very good for their business. They made a lot of money building Jeeps and tanks and airplanes. There was the way, again, this combination of public and private. We see it again and again in American history where business and government work together. It's not like that they're always like, oh yeah, we love each other. No, but there have been ways to, this is the way you get out of crisis. So this is all a way of saying, I see this is a great crisis that we could, in a way we saw some of this economic instability coming, like just like the Roaring 20s were a very, very unstable, unequal economy. Our growth in the last decade has been really unstable and really unequal, right? Some regions, some people, some industries have made so much money and been prospered so much. And then others have been left out. And we see this vividly in like where you live in the Valley, where I live in Seattle, that have been booming, like more people, there's so many people coming in, but all these people, like, you know, people in Salinas getting on a bus to for a 3-hour commute to, you know, work in a Tesla factory. Like, it is crazy how, and so now we have this economic crisis that is taking those, laying all those bare, and then also expanding it to whole groups of people who have been kind of living on the economic edge, and now the cliff, you know, we've fallen off a cliff. And so this is going to require some serious public policy and really thoughtful policy interventions to get those markets back and give those people economic security, which is really what the New Deal was all about, security.
You say, I love all this. The book, The Code, you talk about how we regard and adopt technology, and as it relates to my question is like, what should we know about how we regard and adopt technology into our national or our personal narrative? So if you know, you're talking about public and private technology and, you know, sort of more traditional sectors, what should we come away with as an understanding of how those intertwine in a way that we can also be stewards of success?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we've had this, you know, Americans have had this relationship with digital technology, at least. It's been this combination of fascination and fear since the 1940s, really. And that was one thing that I really came to appreciate as I was putting together the book and looking at the entire longer history and thinking about how we think about these technologies in our lives. For example, concern about privacy and computers' invasion of privacy has been around since the first mainframe, and in fact was the subject of pretty vigorous Capitol Hill debate in Washington, D.C. in the 60s. That was really, and here's what's so interesting. The way that we approach and respond to technologies and digital technologies is very much a reflection of like broader anxieties in the culture, or the things, or also hopes that we have. So in the 1960s, a lot of the criticism and worry about what computers knew was focused on government computers, because the government was a big user of mainframes. And so this is happening at the same time as the Vietnam War. This is also happening at the same time when J. Edgar Hoover is running the FBI and, you know, is spying on Americans, it turns out. And so all of the concerns about what does the government know and how might they use this information to limit my constitutional rights or find out something about me that I don't want to be known. And so what comes out of all that debate is a Federal Privacy Act of 1974, which is all about computers. If you go to you can look it up online. It's like, if you look at the beginning of the Privacy Act, it's really kind of starts from computers know too much, and so we need to figure out limits. But it didn't limit data collection by any entity, governmental or private sector. And it focused chiefly on giving citizens the right to know what the government knew about them. There was no restriction or no mention of what private sector actors who were using the same technology a lot for like marketing and, you know, mail order stuff. There was no limit on private industry. And so that is, you know, US doesn't have a privacy law. And it creates, you know, no one was thinking, oh, one day there's going to be a Facebook, but really it makes the ad-based business model of the internet possible. It allows you to monetize individuals' data in the way that Google and Facebook and so many others have. And so when you see this longer history, it also makes, it can be, I think it's very useful to realize that a lot of things we're feeling are not new, and the phenomena that we're experiencing have a history, and so we need to understand where it came from. And it does give you more control. It's made me a little more like, when it comes to privacy, I think it's something that individuals should worry a lot about, but I'm also like, that train left the station when I was a toddler, right? I'm a little less, it's made me personally a little less paranoid, which
Mm-hmm.
maybe for good or for ill.
Mm-hmm.
But it also makes you understand, there are tools we can use. We have the control, we have the power in the policymakers that we elect and what we ask them to do, and what we ask of the platforms and the products that we use. Consumers have a great deal of power, the power of the pocketbook. So history shows us multiple examples of how people have used that to affect real change.
I love that, because my next question for you is about how do you step into something, is it a professional that feels scary? And you're talking about how we actually can consider our current state as a nation based
Mm-hmm.
on the past in a way that we also shouldn't be intimidated or anxious. Because there's really, from fear, there will be no progress. So for
Yeah.
anybody who's really thinking about what they want to do in their next step of their career, or they're
Mm-hmm.
having trouble feeling like they can proceed just for fear or anxiety, what would your
Mm-hmm.
recommendation to them be?
Yeah. It's hard. I mean, we're entering a really fearful time. It's going to be both, it's going to be one in which change is very difficult, like
Mm.
harder to just pick and be like, I'm going to move across the country. I don't have a job in this new city, but I'll just find one. That's going to be harder, right? But also it's good. It's quickly precipitating a lot of change, a change in the workplace. Like, look at the way that you and I are having this interview now, like the way that, I mean, my teaching has gone online, and I don't think we're going to see the end of the in-person classroom, but man, oh man, college is changing fundamentally from here on out. So I think it's a combination of recognizing, again, separating, there's some things I can't control and there are other things that I can. And also recognizing, one thing I say to my students a lot, for people who are, when you're in college or you're starting your career, it feels like my first job is the highest stakes thing ever. And actually, we all have not only multiple jobs, but multiple careers over the course of our lifetime, right? I didn't think I was going to work in politics. I ended up working on a presidential campaign. Then I ended up working in the federal bureaucracy. And then I end up becoming a college professor. And and then and I'm writing columns, and I'm doing all these things that it wasn't, again, when you and I were writing Carpool in Little Rock, Arkansas in the 70s and 80s, we weren't like sharing with ourselves, one day this is where we want to end up. Like, right? You just don't realize where life is going to take you. So I think you have to appreciate it's a long game. This is going to be a long, hard time. And I think but change is, we do have control, more control than we think. History is made from the top down and the bottom up. It's made from people who's in power matters a lot, whether it's at the top of companies or, whether it's the C-suite or the West Wing, it matters a lot. But also history is made by individual people working individually, but even more importantly, collectively around a shared goal and pushing the needle. And sometimes it takes a really long time. Look, the civil rights movement did not start with Martin Luther King. It started in the 1860s. It started in the 1830s. It was a very, the NAACP was founded a half century before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, or more than half a century before. It's a long road, but there is, we have to remember that we also can't sit back and kind of curl up on our Zoom cocoons and be like, nothing's good, I mean, we do need to mourn what's been lost, and a lot has been lost and is continuing to be lost. And we also have to, think that we're, what the next thing is looking like. And I think that the younger generation, not to just focus sort of chiefly on younger people, but I think the people of the generation below us are also have this toolkit, a digital toolkit, a global outlook, often ideas about the way society can and should work that are hopeful and looking forward. And I'm ultimately, history makes me an optimist, not a pessimist.
What guidance are you giving to young people, but also what does it feel like to be a mom and have the career that you've had?
Yeah. Well, I feel incredibly lucky to have the career I've had, and I have. It's a rare job that has allowed an immense amount of flexibility over the years, and also kind of in the, intervening weeks and months that I'm able to, teach at times of the day where I could, go and take my kid to the pediatrician at 10 a.m. if I needed to.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
very few professional parents have the amount of flexibility I have, and I'm very, very grateful and appreciative of it. That being said, I work really hard. I talk about my kids a lot to my students, and I talk about in class. I feel it's very important to model for men and women in college that a working mother is doing what I'm doing, and to also, I'm very conscious about making it clear that I'm a mom, and my kids are extremely important, and I have 2 daughters, and I want to model for them what it is like to do. There are a whole range of things that parents can do, but this is one thing that I can do. And it is, it's really tough. American society does not make it easy to be a parent and to be working at your full capacity. I will acknowledge that for the first, there was a good 7-year period where I felt like I was kind of doing everything at C+ level, right? I was parenting and working and it was when the kids are little, it's really hard. And my children are now 14 and 11, and I'm grateful every day as we're here in the shelter at home bunker that they are, self-directed and doing their schoolwork, that they, I'm not changing diapers. Like, I feel for the parents of small people. But here's a really interesting societal change that I want to track and that I think is really important, is how is this period of working at home for everybody going to alter broader business practice in all realms, public, private, nonprofit, about where people work and remote work, and what sort of opportunities might that open up for parents and caregivers, more flexibility about where you work and how you work and when you work, which could be an extraordinary opportunity. And really, while it erases these boundaries we have between home and work in ways that aren't always healthy, I think it acknowledges the reality that so many caregivers and parents struggle with.
Yeah, I'm a working mom as well, as you know, and I feel more honest probably at this time in my life than I've ever felt in just being able to say, okay, I need to do this for my family now, or I need to step away from this. I think I was always, even 2 months ago, would figure out a way where it needed to be on the weekend, or I was apologetic for needing to leave after 8 or 9 hours, which was ridiculous, right? It should be fine. And I do feel that this perhaps has given us more permission to be humans in the workforce rather than just employees.
I'm, usually when I've done video interviews, I sit in my campus office and I have all of these academic books behind me and I'm looking super professorial. I'm talking to you now from my kids' playroom. I'm trying to get better light angle.
No, it's all good.
It's and my dog may come in at any moment and his tail may be wagging in the foreground of my face. And that is, and look, you and I are now senior women who have, we have privilege and we have status to feel like that's not going to endanger us. But man, oh man, I don't think anyone can keep their dog from bursting into the room. And it is, it is alighting these boundaries that, it's recognizing the reality. And I hope that it gets us to a more equitable workplace in some ways.
So as we then wrap it up and tell those who are listening about next steps, or just the essence of as they face their future and put one foot in front of the other to figure out what's right for them, what would be your suggestion?
These are crazy times. It's extraordinary. I think first, everyone should recognize that this moment, and we're talking in late April 2020, when everyone's still sheltering at home and it's not clear when that's going to end, that you are living through history. You're living through extraordinary times. There has not been something like this. Being completely blown sideways with it is okay. Like, if you weren't, that would be weird. We shouldn't be taking up new hobbies. We shouldn't be, it's okay to binge watch Tiger King. Maybe not, that was weird, but it was, I did it. It's okay to be, but it's funny. I, for so long, was longing for a pause button on life, right? So life gets so busy and so crazy, and you're doing everything, like, kids soccer practice to dance recitals to I've got to write this article to this review to this teach this class and da 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 da, right? And I would just say to myself, oh, can we just like stop everything for a little bit so I can catch up? And now, well, okay, got what I wanted, and now I'm binge watching Tiger King and worrying about my parents in the middle of the night. So it's, it's not quite as expected. But how can we take this moment and recognizing that this is traumatic, that this is to not be like, oh, let's find a way to, recognize that we are all traumatized to some degree or another, and recognize people who are making such immense sacrifices, and how lucky I am to be sitting in my kids' playroom talking to you on Zoom, right? I'm not, and I know that there's food on the table, and I know that I have a job and that sort of thing, like recognizing that, but also taking advantage of the pause button to the best we can to really reflect on what our lives are, the things we care most about. I think this has been, we've gotten to have family dinner every night and sit down at the table, and man, oh man, that is a gift. And how, what gifts does this bring us, and how can we take those and preserve those in the weeks and the months to come? Because gosh, we're really going to need them. We're going to need those important gifts, and the friends and the family and the things that we treasure, and ourselves as we go forward.
Well, Margaret O'Mara, thank you, because this has been a gift. I'm so grateful to hear about your journey, to reconnect with you, to think about my active participation in the history of our nation, which is now, and in the hopefulness that comes with putting one foot in front of the other, and knowing that we'll be able to persevere.
Yeah. This has been great. Thank you so much for having me. It's been fun.
So I hope that you will stop